This is the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria, session number 34.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
Hey everyone, it's Matt. Thanks for joining me for session 34 of the Behavioral Observations Podcast. Today's episode is a return of session 13 guest, Dr. Megan Miller. In today's episode, we're going to talk about 7 steps to establishing instructional control, as well as managing problem behaviors that are maintained by escape without using extinction procedures. So Megan has done a lot of work on this topic, on both these topics, and also has a neat little course, a little CE course that she's put up on navigationbehavioralconsulting.com. So if you're interested in more information about what we talk about today, you can head over there and check it out. I'll have the links for that in the show notes. But it's kind of a back to basics episode today, and I think it's great not only for new practitioners, but for those of us who've been around for a while and just need to be reminded about the basics. I know I certainly took a lot of information away from this episode, and I hope you do too. So Megan is going to also join me for a behavioral observation membership Zoom hangout later on in the month, specifically on September 27th. If you're not familiar with the Behavioral Observations membership group, it's a small group. We get together about every 4 to 8 weeks, and we hop on a Zoom call, and sometimes we have special guests like we do with Megan, and we get to talk face-to-face. So we did not get a chance to have listener questions in this show. Time did not permit that. So again, if you have questions about the topics we talk about today, or if you have topics about peak, and as a matter of fact, Megan is going to be flying around the country and also internationally doing trainings on the peak autism curriculum. So if you want to come on and ask Megan anything, she'll be happy to field questions. She's a tremendous resource, and I'm happy to have her for this event on the 27th. I also want to let you know while we're talking about the membership that Greg Hanley has also agreed to join us for a membership Zoom hangout, and that'll occur probably sometime in November. So when I get the details as to when that's going to be, I will let you know about that. And again, if you have questions about the membership group in general, you can go to behavioralobservations.com/membership. And before we get to the episode today, I do want to let you know that we are sponsored by Britton Behavioral Consulting. Dr. Lisa Britton provides awesome independent fieldwork supervision. So if you are looking for high-quality supervision, or if you know of people who do need those services, you can go to BrittonBehavioralConsulting.com. That's BRITTON, behavioralconsulting.com. You know, I've corresponded with mentees of hers before. They all sang her praises and talked about what a great supervisor she was, how much they learned from her, and so forth. And I think it's just a great opportunity to benefit from her wealth of knowledge in all things behavior analysis. If you're not familiar with Lisa's work, you can check out session 29 of the podcast, and she kind of goes into her background and her kind of method for providing high-quality supervision. But long story short, again, just check out BrittonBehavioralConsulting.com. And more generally, you know, with all the stuff we mentioned in today's show, if you go to behavioralobservations.com and look under session 34, we will have kind of like a recap of all the links and resources that were mentioned in today's episode. So without any further ado, please enjoy this second conversation with Dr. Megan Miller. Dr. Megan Miller, thanks for coming back to the Behavioral Observations Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Matt. I'm excited to be back on.
Awesome. Now, I know there's been a ton of things that have happened since the last time we chatted, so I figured I'd just start the interview by asking you to kind of give us an update about the various and sundry things that you've been up to since we last chatted.
Okay. So the beginning of 2017 was quite busy because my husband was relocated to St. Petersburg, Florida. So for the first 6 months of the year, I commuted back and forth living in Panama City and St. Pete But now I'm officially settled in St. Pete and loving it. There's a lot of behavior analysts here, and it seems like a really good collaborative group, so that's exciting. And I have been working with Dr. Dixon and his students with the peak assessment, and we're getting ready to start a new training program for that. So we have a clinic in Virginia Beach where we'll be doing peak training with one of his recent graduates, Leah. She'll be working with children, and then people can come observe her working with children and get more like hands-on training with peak. And we're rolling out a new certification process where people can attend a 2-day workshop and additional trainings to get different levels of certification. So I'm really excited about that project.
What does that certification confer? Is it just kind of a demonstration of competency in the, not just, but is that what it entails basically?
Yes. Right. So a lot of people have been wanting to come to the workshops and get more training on it. So the first level is just to demonstrate that you've attended a workshop and you've, it definitely confers that you're more competent than like if you hadn't, because the workshop's going to include a lot of hands-on training. The ultimate goal, though, is for people that want to train others on peak and do their own workshops. There's 3 levels. So the 3rd level gets you to that point where you could then go train others on how to do peak, the peak assessment. So hopefully helping to develop people's skill set so that there's a little bit more integrity and fidelity with it than people just picking it up and trying to run with it. It's a great assessment in that you can just pick it up and run with it, but there's different intricacies about it and how the modules work together and the best way to do the programming and assessing and like different materials to use and all of that kind of stuff that the training will provide.
Yeah, I would agree. You know, I have all 4 modules and have started kind of basically looking through them, trying to teach myself, you know, on them and things like that. But I can totally see how that advanced level of training is going to be helpful for lots of practitioners. So hopefully we'll get some training up in the New England area going soon, and I'll be able to participate in those.
Yeah, I know he was working on one in Boston, but I can't remember. That's the other thing is we'll be ramping up the workshops, and like every month, hopefully we'll have one in a different location, depending on what people are requesting. So
very cool, very cool. I've been trying to get Mark to come up to New Hampshire for a while, so hopefully we'll get him at least, if not to Boston, a little bit north. So
yep.
Anyway, and I know you've also been doing some, continuing doing some international work, and that was kind of a focus of one of our original components of our interview, where you were talking about how to do consultation, kind of in a hybrid on-site remote setting. Do you want to kind of bring us up to date in some of the things you've been up to since then?
Sure. So we talked last fall. The most recent thing was over the spring, we went to Dubai and did a training for RBTs there. And part of our focus was obviously, the requirements for the RBTs from the BACB, but we really focused heavily on best practice in behavior analysis and how they could recognize if they were in a proper setting, because one of the issues that we're starting to encounter, and this happens everywhere, but it's even more prevalent in certain international locations, is people claiming to have a good understanding of behavior analysis, but not necessarily, even if they're certified, they just don't really have that competency that you would expect, especially if they're directors and supervising, a lot of people. So we really tried to help disseminate information on quality behavior analytic services, and we're going to continue to do that. So in the fall, we're going twice, in October and November, to help with some shadow training. They have paraprofessionals who go into the schools with children, and so we'll be helping to train them so that they have some basic classroom management and behavioral skills. It's not RBT, it's just kind of a basic training. And continuing to expand, hopefully, the number of clients that we're helping as well in terms of training and developing programming and things like that. And we're hoping to do a peak workshop there in November.
Awesome. Well, the reason why I wanted to bring that up, because I think that, I think many, although there are quite a few listeners in outside of North America to this podcast. I know sometimes we can kind of get the idea that this is just more or less a kind of a I guess a practice that occurs in our kind of American or North American world. So it's good to get that outside perspective and kind of wrestle with those challenges that are present in some of those settings where there aren't a lot of practitioners and things like that. So I think the fact that you're not only doing some of that basic training, but also trying to help them discriminate both, kind of effective and perhaps less so, practices is great stuff. So it's great stuff for the field, and hope to hear more about that down the road. But what I want to do right now is kind of transition into the main topic that I want to bring you on to talk about, and that is talking about, gaining instructional control with reluctant learners, and also dealing with escape extinction, or alternatives to escape extinction more specifically. So this is kind of what I want to talk about, and we're going to be talking a little bit about the book that you co-wrote with Robert Schramm. Let's see, it is, I've got it right here, The 7 Steps to Earning Instructional Control. So I think the first part, what I'd like to do is kind of go through those 7 steps, and then what we can do is transition to talking about, what happens even with learners who are under instructional control who nonetheless have occasional behavior problems that are associated with escape. So I guess the first thing before we kind of dive into this would be to kind of ask you, what is your definition, if we're to operationally define instructional control, how would you conceptualize that?
So the basic definition, I usually just use more of kind of a layperson definition, would be that the learner is motivated to follow whatever instructions you're presenting, and then that they also seek out learning opportunities with you. So when you look at stimulus control and you've paired yourself with reinforcement and you have that history with a learner, then obviously the probability that they're going to respond when you present instructions is higher. But it's not just that they're responding and compliant, but that it's an active learner that's like eagerly trying to engage with you in the learning environment as opposed to trying to escape from it.
I see. Okay. All right. So let's go through these 7 steps here. The first step is called reinforcement control. So what do you mean by that?
So to clarify, before we go into all of the 7 steps, Robert Schramm is the one who sort of put these lovely names on the steps and kind of put this all together in a treatment package. As we go through these, I'm sure the listeners will recognize that we're not talking about any like novel, groundbreaking information. But it was interesting the way that Robert and I came to sort of work together is he had posted on a listserv and I had posted on a listserv very similar recommendations for a child that was engaging in escape behavior. And he was like, wait a minute, how did you come up with that? And I was like, I just did. And then he sent me, his work. And I was like, oh, that's, much more well-developed than what I've put together. And the really appealing thing about the 7 steps is even though as we go through these steps, probably most listeners will say, yes, that's nothing new. It's putting these 7 steps together as a treatment package that's really helpful, especially when you're working with parents or teachers or other people who may not have as well of a history with behavior analysis. And the research that I did with looking at training people on the 7 steps, we found that if all 7 steps aren't implemented, then you see a decrease in compliance. So there's tons more research that needs to be done, but it definitely shows that having these 7 things happening at one time is really important in terms of developing that relationship with your clients where they want to learn from you and are following your instructions. So just a little disclaimer there.
Well, I would also say that even though some of these steps, like as you say, aren't necessarily groundbreaking per se and may not necessarily be novel to practitioners, I'll say 2 things. One is we have a lot of students who listen to this show, and so I think for many of those, this will be very helpful information. And then 2 would be that even though perhaps the individual steps aren't earth shattering in their, I guess, clinical relevance. I just want to underscore what you're saying about I think the curation or of these kind of makes this program unique. And so, as you say, when some of these steps aren't in place, it leads to less instructional control. I think that's noteworthy. So, um, so so you were about to go ahead and interrupt you. So please continue.
Okay, so step one, looking at having control over reinforcement. So when I talk about that step, I say the adult is in control of the fun items. So anything that the client you're working with is preferring and motivated by has to be under the adult control, meaning they don't just get to walk around the room and interact with their preferred items. Either you have them on your body and like you're wearing an apron and they're tucked in your pockets, or you have containers that they're in that the person can't open or they're out of reach. All of those kinds of environmental structuring that you have to do. And again, that's, most people, yes, we have to control access to reinforcers. But the idea is whenever they would earn access to the fun items, not only does it come through the adult, but you're part of that process. So it's not just, oh, yep, here, let me get this container down and open it and just hand it over to you. But it's making it fun. And that's going to be step two, but it's making it fun as you're engaging with the learner with the fun items. So not only is it you have control over the items, but then you have to move into step two and be part of the fun that the items bring for the learner.
Okay, let's stay with step one just for a minute, though, because I just have a couple questions. One is, it's just clarification, is so that basically it sounds like you have to kind of sanitize the environment a little bit and make sure there's no kind of, free access to reinforcers.
Yes.
What happens if you're working with kiddos that either they engage in stereotypy, and the reinforcers are on board, if you will. I can think of certain cases that I've worked with where, kids will, visually, or it appears if they're visually stimming on decorations in a classroom, and things like that. And in addition to having reinforcers that are more tangible in nature also, but, left to their own devices or in a situation where they don't have things, to kind of play with or interact with, they can happily entertain themselves through, some form of stimming.
Yep. So that's definitely a question that comes up every single time we present on this topic. And my answer is, if it's something where they're stimming and it's like with objects, that's a little bit easier to control because you can obviously just control access to those objects and then give them contingent on the learning setting and participation. If they're engaging in stimulatory behavior where they're just basically entertaining themselves with their own bodies, then you have a little bit more work to do. And typically, if I encounter a client who's at that high of a level of engaging in stereotypy, what I would be doing is I wouldn't even be focusing on instructional control at that point. I'd be focusing on developing reinforcers and getting my pairing and like their value of me increase to a point where I could then develop instructional control. So in terms of like your how you're going to run your sessions and work with someone, if they don't even interact with their environment or recognize that you're there, that's what you're going to have to work on first before you even try to develop instructional control to teach them.
I see. And I guess another question that I'm willing to bet many listeners are kind of asking right now is, let's say removing the reinforcers from the environment, or removing free access to the reinforcers in the environment occasions problem behavior. How does one go about controlling the reinforcement when we know reinforcement has a history of, or at least the removal of the reinforcers has a history of evoking challenging behaviors?
Right. So that's something that Robert goes into detail on in his book, Motivation and Reinforcement. And it might be in the 7 Steps book you mentioned. I can't remember what all we put in that one. But basically the idea is well, there's two things. One, when we sanitize the environment, we try to do it when the child's not around. So, when they go to bed, or if they're at school, when they're not at school, you get everything kind of re-sanitized, put away, up. That way, when they come into the environment, it's all already not available. And then if you're working with a learner where that's really an issue, we basically at first don't even worry about taking items back, but we try to limit where they can travel. So Robert has a really good example of this on his YouTube page. And if you want to put that link in the show notes, I can send it to you. But
Sure.
basically picking a location in the room, whether it's a table or a carpet or, just a specific room in the house, but the items stay there. So when they're engaging with the item, if they try to leave the designated area, you say, hey, this needs to stay here. And then they can leave. They're free to leave the area, but the items stay with you. So that's starting to set some boundaries with the items. And then while you're working on that, you'll also have a program in place where you're working on giving up items, giving up preferred items. So there's obviously different ways to work on like a give me type program depending on the learner. But I actually have a webinar that I'll hopefully have on our website towards the end of July, beginning of August, that talks about some of those types of learner skills that might be helpful if people are wanting to know more about how to teach like give me and wait and those kinds of things. But you basically have to target that skill deficit first.
Got it. All right. So let's move on to pairing with reinforcement. I know you kind of already prefaced that a little bit, but by all means, continue.
Sure. So step 2, I always shorten and just say have fun. So for that step, basically what you're looking at is, hopefully we've all heard about being like a walking M&M, and the child should be running towards you, not from you. So spending a good amount of time, especially at the beginning of, working with a client and developing that positive relationship with them. So the interesting thing to me when I first saw Robert present that really stuck with me was the idea for pairing, that when I was initially trained on pairing, it was like, yeah, you have fun for a few minutes in your session, but then you intersperse a lot of demands and you provide them the reinforcement. And while they're playing with the reinforcer, you're taking data. But the way that we do it now, and that Robert will show in his workshops, if you ever get a chance to go see one, is it's not that simple. Like you have to be constantly engaging with them and making the items more fun with you than without you. So whenever they earn those preferred items, it's not just, okay, here you go, here's your ball or whatever. It's like you're playing with them with the ball and you're making it more fun because you're making funny noises or exaggerated facial expressions, or you're doing something better with the ball than what they could do with the ball. So it seems really like this one for a lot of people might be like, yes, of course we have to pair. But when you really dive in deep with it, this one, and to me, is one of the hardest ones to train people on and to accomplish, because if you're not naturally a fun person, it's really hard to train people to do it.
Yeah, I could see that. It's funny. I was talking with someone who was observing a therapist work with a child on the spectrum in a home therapy program, and they were remarking to me like, all this person is doing is playing. And they had just started up with this particular provider, and it's like they're not doing any work. And I'm like, well, I think what they're doing is, and I kind of just went ahead to describe that. I could see how that would be frustrating, or at least apparently on the surface non-productive from a lay person's perspective. So
yeah. And my favorite example with the pairing, I don't think Robert has a video of it on his YouTube page, but when we talk about pairing with items, people it's that whole idea that I was talking about before, like keeping the items with you. And so if they try to go away, that's fine, but they can only have the items and engage with the items if they're allowing you to be part of that experience. And that's really important if you're working with children with autism, because they don't value us anyway. So if we're trying to provide a reinforcer to them and we give them the reinforcer and we take our data, what are they developing more of a value of? Items, objects, the thing that they already have value for. We want them to value us. So being able to really make yourself part of that object and part of that experience is crucial. And I think a lot of the times we don't really pay attention to that and like really key in on the fact that like we can't just continue to develop their object obsessions. We need to develop their people obsessions. And the way to do that is to make ourselves part of the object. But one of the examples that Robert will show in his workshop is with a child with music. So what they would do is the child really liked music. They would play the music, and if the child was engaging with the adults in the environment, the music stayed on. But as soon as the child chose to stop engaging, the music would turn off. Mm-hmm. And over time, you see quickly that the child, spends way more time with the adults in the environment because of the access to the music, and they start to become paired with the music and develop value themselves. And a lot of the times, I don't think when people think about, pair yourself with reinforcement, that they go that deep with it into that level. So it's really, really thinking about how can, we make sure that whatever they're finding reinforcing, that we're becoming part of that experience.
I see. Yeah, that's such a good point. And I, can see so many non-examples of that, certainly. And, certainly just looking back over, mistakes that I've made as a practitioner, early on, I can, identify with many of those. So, all right. So let's talk about being consistent and having follow through.
Okay. So for that one, I shorten it and just say, mean what you say. So this one I think is really hits home well with the parents or like teachers that may not have a lot of experience with behavior analysis. But basically, it's just the idea that if you present an instruction, then you need to follow through on requiring the instruction to be completed. But it also, what I like to point out is being clear as well. So if you present something as a choice, then you need to honor the person's decision. So if you say, can you or will you, whatever, can you sit down? And the child says no.
Or do you want to? Oh my gosh, exactly. I see that so much. Do you want to do, your work?
And if they say no, you have to honor that, And so if you present something as a question, you need to be ready to, be okay with whatever their decision is. And then if you do that by accident, obviously like a few seconds later, you could say, okay, now it's time to do your work and fix your mistake. But I think a lot of the times people don't catch that the way that they're talking. And a lot of the clients we work with are really literal. So, you have to be really careful about watching your language and making sure. And like sometimes people will say, okay, we're just doing one more and then we're done. And then they do like 5 more.
Yes.
Be clear. Be clear about what you mean and make sure you follow through. So of course, if you present something as a demand, like you need to sit down and the child doesn't sit down, then you would obviously follow through and require them to sit down. However, with the 7 steps, we do that without forcing them to sit down or using PACE prompts. And that's something I think we're going to talk about a little bit later.
Okay, so the next step says focus on positive rather than negative reinforcement. And of course, many people are going to listen to this and say, well, yeah. But so tell us a little bit more about what you mean by that.
Yep. So, and when I talk about this stuff, I always tell people listening equals positive reinforcement. So the idea that whenever they first, especially when you're first starting with a learner, any simple little thing that they do should contact positive reinforcement. So I usually just focus on that part of this stuff as like the big take home point. I actually rarely talk about the negative reinforcement part because a lot of the people that I train are teachers or parents, and they wouldn't even have that discrimination to make anyway. It's just the idea that, if the student is listening, you need to be providing them with like praise and or tangible reinforcement for that. So I focus heavy on that part of it. And give examples like, especially when they first come into the classroom, if they're about to sit down, then you would tell them to sit down and reinforce that because they're going to be successful. They're already about to do the thing anyway. That gives you an opportunity to pair reinforcement with listening to instructions. So that's, like I said, the piece I focus on a lot. The comparison between positive and negative reinforcement, it's really funny because when I first started in the field, too many years ago to talk about, I was definitely trained. I'm sure you probably were as well. And there may be even some listeners who still are being trained this way, but basically the idea that you present your trial block, and then you tell the child go play, and you turn the chair and they run off and play with toys while you sit there and take data.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a negative reinforcement setup, right? Like they get to escape from you.
Yes.
So and it was funny because at a conference, I don't know, one of my first ABA conferences, I actually had like a debate with someone who was saying that they prefer to use negative reinforcement and that like that's what we should all be doing. And I was just blown away that like someone who was a BCBA would say that. And the unfortunate reason that they gave for that was because it was easier for them. I don't have to do as much work if I just tell them to go play. And I'm like, but how are they going to want to value working with you? But anyway, so of course you want to avoid the negative reinforcement aspect because, you know, you want to be developing yourself as a reinforcer, and the learner shouldn't want to go play. They should want to stay with you and learn from you and play with you. So the more you're giving them positive reinforcement for following directions and learning with you, the more valuable you'll become, and you won't need negative reinforcement. I do have clients occasionally, especially when you first start, where there is literally no other reinforcer. Like, so you just don't want to be around people, and that might be what you have to use at first, but that should be, you know, a temporary place.
I see. Alrighty. And so the next step is using continuous reinforcement and then expanding the ratio of reinforcement. So tell us a little bit about that.
Okay. So again, this is one that's more, I think, helpful for parents and teachers. A lot of people that are in behavior analysis would already be familiar with that, but basically just the idea that you want to consistently reinforce, especially when you're first teaching. So it's similar to step 4, like listening equals reinforcement, and step 5 kind of tie together because you want to do it every single time that they listen. You're providing access to a reinforcer, and then you can fade that out as they're more quickly and readily following your instructions. That one's not real detailed.
Right. So let's move on to step 6, prioritizing yourself and your learner.
Yes. So for that one, I say know your priorities. And this one, it's interesting because a lot of people think they know their priorities, but then things don't go the way you're expecting. And it's really, you really quickly realize you don't know your priorities. And what I mean by that is, so you might have your goals and your targets written down, and it's like, okay, you know, this is what I'm trying to teach my learner how to do. But when the learner does something unexpected, how are you supposed to respond to that? So you have to know your overall like priorities for the learner and for the session. So the example that Robert will often give, and that I've taken to using as well, is if you're working with a child and they say cookie for the first time but slap you in the face. And I just gave it away because I said it. They just said cookie and slapped you in the face. What would you do? And it's if they've never ever spoken a single word in their entire lives, I'm giving that kid the cookie. Right? Like, I don't care that they hit me in the face. They've talked for the first time ever. Okay. So knowing that priority, you know, this is a learner who is trying to develop communication. And if they happen to say their first word while engaging in aggression, I'm going to go ahead and reinforce that, but not again, you know, in the future. However, if it's a kid that talks all the time and they slap me in the face, then no, obviously I'm not going to give them the cookie. So kind of knowing what to do in those unexpected situations, or like if your target, you know, is for them to say cuff or cookie, but they say ookie, which is actually a better approximation. Are you reinforcing that? You know, so really being able to analyze and think through what exactly you're working on with the client is really important as well.
I see. I know we touched upon this earlier, but let's circle back to handling challenging behaviors. And it looks like the steps are broken down in a couple of different ways here, both handling problem behavior with extinction and through punishment. So talk about problem behaviors as it relates to these 7 steps.
Well, the last step is actually about problem behavior. So do you want to go into that? Or?
Yeah.
Okay. So for the last step, I summarize it as challenging behavior does not result in reinforcement. So basically the idea is if the learner engages in any behavior that is not something that people in the environment would like for them to be doing, then they should not access reinforcement for that. So that could be, you know, your typical challenging behavior like aggression, property destruction, any other escape related type things like running off or dropping to the ground, throwing materials. But it could also be things like climbing on top of the table, or just like staring off into space, or maybe even engaging in stimulatory behavior. So really anything that is not conducive to their learning shouldn't result in reinforcement. So what we talk about is when those types of things start happening, we shut down the fun. So if you're implementing the 7 steps properly, the whole entire time you're with the child, or at least 90% of the time, should be this like glorious, fun, exciting interaction where they're just, very motivated and very positive affect, and you're having a great time together, interspersing demands, but playing and all of that kind of stuff. As soon as they start to choose to do something that doesn't promote learning, you just shut that fun down. So you should have like all of your reinforcers and preferred items kind of out at this point while you're working. And then if they start to do something that's not conducive to learning, you start pulling the items towards you and kind of like packing up like, okay, well, I'm going to leave if you don't want to work with me. Mm-hmm. And Robert has a great video example of that on his YouTube page as well. And then then typically what will happen if you've developed instructional control is the child will be like, wait a minute, I don't want you to go. And then whenever they stop engaging in the challenging behavior, you bring back the reinforcers. So it's not really any different than, what we're typically trained to do. The difference is we don't work to pull the child back in. So if we've shut down all the fun, we have control of the reinforcers and the environment in terms of like the preferred tangible items. We're not engaging with them. We're not giving them attention. We haven't removed the demand. They still would have to finish the demand once they come back to us. So they shouldn't be accessing anything during that time. It's just like a desert. There's nothing happening.
Sure.
And then as soon as they show a motivation again, whether it's approaching you, whether it's requesting something, if they're staring off into space and they look back at the materials, whatever, the challenging behavior stops, then you start to bring the reinforcers back. So if a demand was present, you'll say, oh, okay, sit down first and do this. And then you'll start ramping back that fun and engaging with them again, and they'll get the reinforcement. So that's what step 7 refers to. Again, that one's more towards like parents and teachers, but from a behavior analytics standpoint, it is different in that we don't force them back into the learning setting. They choose to come back, and then we engage them again.
Now, I think it's worth pointing out that probably has a higher likelihood of working, or conversely has a lower probability of success if the previous steps aren't in place, right? In other words, you got to be fun, and you got to be, have a strong pairing. You got to be that, kind of conditioned reinforcer, as well as having control and possession of those primary reinforcers.
Yep.
In order for this to work. Otherwise, if you kind of wait the kid out, it sounds without those things, I would imagine, and not just imagine, because I've seen this, other people attempt to do this, that they, kids go along kind of entertaining themselves and things like that, and it's essentially no skin off their back. So I bring that up not just to point out the obvious, which I'm fond of doing from time to time, but also to just underscore the point that you made earlier, that these 7 steps kind of are indeed a package, and for one to be effective, the others more or less need to be in place.
Right. And that's one of the things, like with the book that you mentioned at the beginning of the interview, what we tell people to do is use the integrity checklist in that book as kind of like a diagnostic thing as well. So if you're working with someone who thinks that they are following the 7 steps, or, is doing a good job with their instructional control, you can go in with that checklist and like score them and identify what's going wrong, basically. So, maybe they're not having fun like they thought they were. Maybe they're not motivating like they thought they were. Maybe they're not being consistent. So you can kind of use that checklist to pinpoint what areas are missing, and then give feedback and training to the person to hopefully fix that and get tighter instructional control. Or you can use the checklist for initial training as well if you have someone who doesn't know anything about behavior analysis or the 7 steps. So that's what kind of we've done. And sometimes though, what will happen is you do go through the checklist and you see that all 7 steps are in place, but whatever they're doing during that challenging behavior time is more reinforcing than you. So then that's where you have to say, okay, well, we have to figure out, how to make ourselves more reinforcing. And it might mean that you kind of pause your programming for a minute, and like for a week or two, you have to just work on really pairing for more time and not having any demands in place and increasing your value over the challenging behavior. And every once in a while I'll have kids where like they're just perfectly content to wander around the room or, go sit in the couch or lay on the floor or whatever. So, but to me, again, that's a symptom to me that, okay, I need to figure out how to become more fun with this kid. Like
Sure.
if they're not wanting to engage with me and they're perfectly happy with just laying down, then I need to figure out how to like tap into their motivation more,
Indeed. All right. So what I want to do is transition to a related topic, which is dealing with escape, maintain, problem behavior. And I know this is something that you've done a lot of presenting on and things like that, and have a lot of good strategies to dealing with escape, maintain, problem behavior in some novel ways that don't necessarily involve escape extinction. And so although I said I want to transition, it's more of perhaps an extension of what we were talking about earlier in terms of, getting good instructional control is helpful to minimize escape, maintain, problem behavior. But, kids will from time to time, at times attempt to escape nonetheless. So let's talk about what to do when kids are trying to get out of doing things, even though the best practices for gaining instructional control might be in place. So, but before we kind of dive into this, I just want to kind of have you take a minute and just kind of define your idea of what escape extinction means, and then that way we can kind of talk about alternatives to doing that and have a real tangible sense of what we're trying to avoid.
Okay. Well, I mean, the technical definition of escape extinction is that you're removing reinforcement, right? Whenever you put something on extinction, you're making sure that reinforcement doesn't occur. So if the reinforcer, presumably for escape maintain behavior, would be escaping the environment. So usually for the children that we work with, we're talking about trying to escape a demand. So you would have to make sure that they're following through with the demand. So that's like the definition of escape extinction. But for whatever reason in our field, it's become synonymous with the procedures that a lot of people are trained to use. So I think people need to kind of re-look at why we're using a same set of procedures for this intervention. Like the intervention shouldn't be the same. Every single child you work with shouldn't have the same intervention.
Mm-hmm.
So, just because a lot of the times we identify, they're trying to escape the setting, so that means we have to use escape extinction, which is great. And like understanding, yes, we need to make sure that they understand that behavior does not get them out of this, but how they're not allowed out of it is kind of just blanketly applied, where either forced prompting or paced prompting is used. And that's what I was trained to do. Like when I first started in the field, I definitely had my experiences with, and this is when I'm talking about this topic too, I always like to make sure everybody understands where I'm talking about, like a discrete trial training where you're just working with kids one-on-one, and the behaviors that they're engaging in are not like life-threatening or really severe. That's a whole different topic.
Sure. No, I get it. I mean, I think we were joking about it prior to hitting the record button that, that's certainly, when I started working with kids and, those types of individualized learning settings, the idea was, they might try to get up, and when they get up, you just kind of put them back in their little seat at the table, and you sit next to them, or you sit with them in a way that, kind of maybe minimizes their access to escape, or block them or whatever. And there's a bunch of different ways that's manifests itself. And then certainly, as you mentioned, some sort of physical prompting strategies and things like that. So
Right.
I think a lot of people listening to this right now can kind of nod their head and identify with those types of experiences for sure.
Yeah, so that's, how I was initially trained. And when I first started, I was working with 2 and 3-year-olds, and it was easy enough to like sit them in my lap and wrap my legs around them and like hand over hand force them to like match cards.
Yeah, but with same.
Yeah. So, and surprisingly, like I had one family I worked with where that whole experience for their initial workshop was so aversive, the kid threw up. And he was only 18 months. And bless that mom, she continued with ABA and he's mainstreamed now. But when we hear these stories about ABA causing PTSD and people talking really negatively about what we do, it's because of those types of things. And why are we continuing to allow that to happen is my question. Mm-hmm. So I, didn't question it at all. That's what we were trained to do. I saw it worked. The kids made progress. They eventually learned they had to do whatever we were making them do. But over time, I was fortunate, I guess, to encounter children where that didn't work. They just fought harder, and they were, even though they were 3 years old, they were like, no, you're not making me do this.
They were a worthy adversary.
I will beat the crap out of you, right? And I'm only 5 feet tall. So when I started working with like older children, even if they were only 5, they could very easily overpower me. So I was like, this is not going to work. Like this procedure is just not, effective for everybody. So that's when I started playing around with like, what are some other ways that we can, work on still implementing escape extinction, but not using force prompting and pace prompting. And pace prompting isn't as bad per se, because with pace prompting, you're basically just repeating the demand on a schedule, whether it's like every minute or 10 seconds or whatever. But if you have a client engaging in escape behavior that's multiply maintained by attention, then that's obviously not restricting access to the reinforcement. So that's a separate issue, I guess. But with the force prompting, especially, there's a lot of issues that come up. And in the one webinar that I have that's going to be on the website, I kind of go through all of the different ethical considerations, and it takes me 3 hours. So obviously we're not going to have time to go through all of that today.
Oh, that's fine. Yeah.
But there are a lot of ethical considerations too. So not just the idea that like, well, we're just going to keep using force prompting because it works. Force prompting might work, but the alternative works as well. So when we're looking at least restrictive and most humane and ethical procedures to use, shouldn't we use the one that's going to be least restrictive and most ethical, not just because they both work, they both can be used. So really the alternative is it's hugely related to the 7 steps. Making sure that you have all of those 7 steps in place, like you mentioned, will decrease the probability of engagement in escape behaviors anyway. But then once the escape behavior occurs, rather than forcing the person back into the learning setting, it's a choice. They can choose to interact with you and continue to gain access to fun, motivating items, or they can choose to not do anything at all and just sit there. And eventually, sometimes initially, it might take, I think, I haven't experienced this, but I think Robert, like the longest that they had to do was like a 2-day shutdown of the fun. They had a really stubborn client, but eventually it gets boring to just have nothing to engage with. So we don't force them into anything. I'll engage myself. I'll play with things, talk to myself. And then when the client, shows an interest, they look at me, they approach me, they ask for the thing. I say, oh, you wanted to do this? Well, first you need to, whatever it was that I had asked them to do in the first place. And then they do it, and then we have fun again. So I've not had to force myself upon them. They're choosing when to be following the instructions and learning versus being forced back into it. And I think that's the key as well. A lot of the times when we look at this difference between like the kid that I would sit in my lap and cross my legs around and hand over hand prompt to match, what was that kid learning? Absolutely nothing. Right? Yeah. Like, if anything, they're learning to become like a limp, compliant, passive person, but they're not learning to be excited about learning or really learning to attend to whatever it was that I was having them match. They're just learning to like relax their body so that I can physically move them around, which isn't a positive skill really for anybody, especially someone with disabilities, to learn, because then they could be taken advantage of later in life.
That's a good point.
Yeah. So there's a lot, like I said, there's a lot of ethical, when you really start, like, I mean, I've been talking about this for 7 years now. And the more that I talk about it, the more I get like upset that people are still engaging in these practices.
Mm-hmm.
But, yeah. So, I mean, it's nothing, super groundbreaking. I don't think, and a lot of behavior analysts that I talk to about it are like, oh yeah, I've had to do that with a client before. And, I've come up with that on my own. And it's like, oh, so you're doing it with all your clients? And they're like, no, just the ones where traditional escape didn't work. And I'm like, well, why?
So let me ask you a functional assessment question here. What are the ways in which you verify? Let's say you have an idea that okay, well, this kiddo is having an occasional behavioral issue during a teaching session. And of course, as we've talked about, you've got, the 7 steps going and things like that, and things for the most part are going along all right. But for these occasional behavior problems, how do you verify that it is indeed escape, especially in the context of a lot of the kind of synthesized contingencies of reinforcement that, folks like Greg Hanley and others are talking about?
Mm-hmm. So, and I think that's a really good point, Matt, because a lot of the kids that are engaging in escape behavior, it's not just for, well, people say is escape behavior, it's not just for escape. And, there's research to support that non-compliance is multiply maintained. For an example, Rodriguez, Thompson, and Bainham in 2010 published a study on that. So I think a lot of the times when people see a child engage in escape behavior, or engage in problem behavior after a demand has been presented, they just automatically say, oh, it's for escape. We need to use escape extinction and like force them through, teach them who's boss and like make them follow this instruction. But really, and this was like one of the main things that pushed me into like only using the 7 steps, but it was before I even knew the 7 steps existed, is that the whole like multiple maintained behavior. So like we had a client who we were using escape extinction with when I was first became board certified, and I went to watch his session. And it's great when you get to be the supervisor and you can watch people, because you can really easily pick up on like, oh, that kid really thinks that's reinforcing. So the therapist was trying to hand over hand prompt him to do stuff. And he was just having a ball and thought it was hilarious. So he was clearly contacting a ton of reinforcement. So what I did with him is we set up a contingency analysis where I gave her like randomly assigned consequences. So whenever he engaged in escape behavior, I had her try different things. And what we ultimately ended up with, seeing that the lowest escape behavior was happening, was the 7 steps, basically. But I had her try like hand over hand prompting him. I had her try paste prompting him. I had her try completely ignoring him. I had her try playing with other things. And we randomly like rotated those, and we looked to see which thing resulted in the lowest level of problem behavior. And then that was, okay, he's not contacting reinforcement when this thing is happening. And that was when she just didn't force him back into the setting, and she engaged herself until he came back around. And then we also had to up, obviously, the pairing and fun before demands were presented. So we implement this. So this is where it gets a little bit tricky. So I've done those analyses, and basically that's what we do is we either do like more of a contingency analysis type thing where we'll randomly assign different contingencies and see where the problem is the lowest. Or in like the functional assessment process, we would use something like Hanley and the ISCA and figure out, what are the synthesized contingencies. And then that way for step 7, we can make sure we're completely shutting off all of the reinforcement. But basically with all of our clients, we implement the 7 steps from the get. And if you have those in place from the beginning, it's very rare that you even have to deal with any of this, that you would even have to do a functional assessment, because the problem behavior doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. So that's nice. It makes the job so much more motivating and fun as well, because you're, going into the session with the client, and you're going to have fun and not have to deal with anything, So if they do, if we have all 7 steps in place and we've assessed that everything is working well from that angle, and the child is still engaging in problem behavior, then, like I said, we would do, a more detailed analysis and figure out like what's going on. And usually what ends up happening is there's some sort of skill deficit and there's some sort of functional replacement that we have to teach. So, maybe you would have a child that is engaging in problem behavior throughout the session. And when we do the more detailed analysis, it turns out like, oh, well, they've got a skill deficit with waiting. So we need to address that. So it usually turns out to be these overarching skill repertoires that need to be taught. And it's not as related to like, oh, they're just trying to access attention or escape or tangible or something like that.
Hey there, I just wanted to jump in and note that Megan did mention the ISCA process. And for those who aren't familiar with the acronym, that is the Interview Informed Synthesized Contingency Analysis. And we've got 3 episodes on the ISCA approach to functional assessment, sessions 1, sessions 7, and session 20, all featuring Greg Hanley. So if you want to learn more about that, you can certainly go back and go to town and figure out exactly how that fits in the context of this discussion. And if you are also interested in getting continuing education, all 3 of those podcasts are eligible for continuing education. So you can head over to behavioralobservations.com and search sessions 1, 7, and 20. And again, if you want the CEs, you can go to behavioralobservations.com/get CEs, and you'll be good to go. Okay, so I think we're all on the same page now. Let's get back to the conversation. Sure. What are some other aspects of dealing with escape that you've been talking about at conferences and elsewhere?
One of the things that, and this is also, I go into like quite a bit of detail on in the webinar. One of the things that's really interesting to me is the more I go to different talks from people working in different parts of the field, it's interesting to watch everyone kind of coming to the same conclusion. So, for example, in 2014, Rosales Ruiz did a presentation at ABAI on the poisoned cue, which is referred to in like animal training and with dogs is what he was focusing on. And they looked at training a dog to follow 2 different commands. And one command they used shaping, where they didn't prompt or like force the dog to do it. They would just give reinforcement as the approximations were achieved. And the other condition or the other command, they used prompting with a leash, which is the human equivalent of like force prompting. So,
Sure.
Kind of whipping the leash a little bit, and it's a little bit more forceful. Both skills were acquired, but more accurate responding happened in a shaping condition, more tail wagging happened in the shaping condition, and more errors happened in the prompting condition. So it's like a completely different, area of behavior analysis, but they're showing the same idea. When you force somebody into doing something, or you force an animal into doing something, the quality of the responding is not the same. And your overall like skill acquisition isn't the same either. That's very interesting to me.
That's fascinating. And we will link up to that webinar in the show notes. But it also reminds me of some of the, a lot of this is reminding me of stuff from the OBM literature, and so if you have employee and performance, and you want to decide, and you can go about that 2 different ways. You can provide reinforcement for performing to a certain standard or performing these specific steps of a task or what have you, or you could, provide reprimands or other type of, kind of punitive consequences for not adhering to that. And you get way more bonus behavior, if you will, or bonus responding, in the first condition than you do in the second condition. So it's interesting to see that, kind of other example of doing that. So.
Right. And that's what's really interesting to me about kind of where our field is with escape, because we know, like, we train people on this stuff. We train ourselves, oh, we need to pair and be positive and all this stuff. And then the minute a kid engages in problem behavior, we're on them in like the most aversive thing possible. It's like, wait a minute, how are they going to see us as a positive if we're doing that as their consequence when they engage in challenging behavior?
Well, another aspect too is also, the other side of that, perhaps in addition or as an alternative to doing the extinction, is perhaps the I don't want to say excessive use of arbitrary reinforcers like edibles and things like that, but there's that too. In other words, we just need to amp up the arbitrary reinforcement. And as you pointed out earlier, many times we do that in a manner that's devoid of context. And devoid of any type of social interaction or pairing and things like that. So, so I think this is helpful information for practitioners, not only just to avoid having to use extinction in these contexts, but also avoiding situations where they're using, indiscriminate, powerful reinforcers that, that are kind of contextually irrelevant.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And it's interesting. I mean, I pretty much see it like in anything I go to. So like I'll go to talks and I'm constantly like, okay, how do the 7 steps fit into this? Or how does what I know about autism fit into, this research that's being done, and kind of tying it all together. And so that's really helpful too. Like the Early Start Denver model has a huge focus on, developing the positive relationship between the adult and the child. And it goes into great detail, much better operationally defined than I've seen in any work by a behavior analyst, on how to develop like sensory routines, and not sensory like integration type sensory, but just, like songs and games and fun stuff that you would do that like toddlers enjoy doing. And how to do that with a child with autism, and the importance of, developing the value of humans, basically. And it goes into all sorts of research on brain development, which that could be a whole separate podcast on, whether or not that research is valid. But based on that research, they show that like children with autism do have, for whatever reason, a higher motivation for objects. And as they're, developing as babies and toddlers, their neurology, their history of reinforcement, if you don't want to talk about neurology, is, getting stronger and stronger with objects, because that's what they're engaging with. And I mean, that makes total sense when you think about it from a behavior analytic perspective. And they even explain it in a behavior analytic perspective in the book. But when you tie that back to the work of the 7 steps and that importance of the pairing and having fun, and what I kind of mentioned earlier, where when you look at a lot of people and how they're doing discrete trial, they're actually furthering and making it worse, that focus on objects, because they're giving the child objects to engage with without pairing themselves with that interaction, So you can kind of like pull all the things together. And, I know we initially started talking about escape, but it's just like a big picture to improve your practice as a behavior analyst, pulling in all of these different concepts.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, we've been going on this topic for nearly an hour here, and I don't want to keep you too long. Do you have any final thoughts on this, or anything that you want to talk about that we haven't covered thus far?
No, I think we covered most of it. I think the big take home point is that so here, actually, there is one thing we didn't cover. So
okay.
If you look at Cooper and like descriptions of extinction and the considerations we have to make with extinction, I think a lot of people don't. Like, we're all aware of the extinction burst, and some people may or may not be aware of the fact that there is research documenting when you put into place extinction procedures that aggression can increase in frequency and intensity, and that when you use physical guidance, that can also increase problem behavior. So there's these kind of negative factors that all sort of combine together. And I think a lot of the times as behavior analysts, we're just trained in like, that's just what to expect. And we get desensitized to it. And when you work with families or teachers or people that aren't in the field and you're proposing plans for the child, really making sure that you're educating them on these negative side effects before you put the plan into place. Because a lot of the times those discussions don't happen. And I think that's like making kind of a bad name because the families may not expect what's going to happen with the child when those procedures happen. So they may not expect that increase in aggression or the problem behaviors. But I also really want to, I guess, encourage people to consider that it's not a necessity. So recently, I had some discussion on Facebook about like extinction bursts, and like the people that were posting just kind of seemed to think like that's just part of the job, and that's just what we have to deal with. And I used to wear it as a badge of honor. I had, a bruise on my arm one time, the shape of a handprint because like a child hit me so hard, but I was like, oh, it was just the extinction burst. That means we're making progress, right. But those things don't have to happen and we can do better. And I think a lot of the times we get, we do see that turnaround happens and the child does end up making progress, but do we have to put ourselves and the child through those things to make that progress? And I would argue that 99% of the time you do not. And if you're working in a situation right now where that's happening a lot for you, evaluating your teaching procedures, are you using the 7 steps? Are you targeting skill deficits and focusing on setting up a successful behavior intervention plan that's based on shaping and really slowly building up their ability to tolerate the new plan and engage in the replacement behavior? Are you just going straight to extinction and not supporting them at all and just kind of working through the problem behavior that comes up with that?
Wow, there's so much in there. And I wasn't laughing at the fact you got injured. I was laughing at the fact that as a young clinician, a very similar thing happened to me. I got, I've been bitten about, a handful of times in my career. And, I've been practicing as a behavior analyst for 18 years or so. And most of the times I've been bitten, it's been my fault. I've just, chose the wrong procedure, put myself in the wrong position or what have you. And the most severe bite I ever got, which left a bruise that turned like every color of the rainbow, seemingly for for like 6 weeks.
Yep.
It was during an escape extinction procedure, and none of those things that and again I was perhaps not putting into place all those considerations that you just mentioned. So I was laughing with you, not at you, of course.
Yeah, no.
I also want to underscore the value of educating parents and other caregivers and teachers for those working in school settings of I kind of cringe when people say this because it's cliche, but there's a truth to it. Certainly, sometimes things might get better before they get worse. And if you're even if you put in place procedures that would minimize the likelihood of these challenging behaviors that you've spent the last hour or so describing, it's important to communicate that nonetheless if things don't go as planned. Certainly, and I know I make a point of describing that in writing in every behavior plan that I write, as well as doing the best I can to verbally communicate that to parents and other caregivers. So those are 2 great points. Megan, this has been a very very fast hour, I should say. I can't believe we've gone through all this stuff so quickly, or it seems quick, and it's been very informative. And I know we've got a lot of not just practitioners, but students of behavior analysis, family members, et cetera, who listen to this show. So it's going to be of a lot of value to a lot of people. I will hunt down all those YouTube and references, the link to the webinar that you're working on and other stuff, and I'll have those in the show notes. And, thanks again for spending some time with us on the Behavioral Observations podcast.
Thank you, Matt. It was a great interview, and I loved talking about this. So it's a great opportunity. Thank you so much.
No problem. Take care.
Bye.
Bye. All right, folks, we've been going at this for over an hour, as we just finished saying, so I want to put a swift close to this. Thanks for spending that hour plus with Megan and myself. We'll have all that information at behavioralobservations.com that we talked about. One last thing, if you enjoy the show and if you hadn't had a chance to do so already, it would be awesome if you went over to iTunes and left a rating and review. That helps publicize the show a little bit more and get the word of behavior analysis out there. But I think I'm going to put a cap on this episode, and so I will see you the next time in episode 35 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. And again, thanks for listening. Take care.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.